Guards dragged a man from a fresh tunnel mouth and slammed his wrists into iron cuffs, while the warden watched from the gallery. Suspicion tightened the chronicler's pen. The chronicler paused, set the pen down, then wrote the time and precise measurements of the tunnel entrance. His notes included the phrase suspicion in the margin and a single caret beside prior escape entries. The prisoners in the yard pressed their faces to the cell bars. The warden folded his hands behind his back and read aloud the charge to the assembled men. The immediate problem was clear. The breakout supplied the administration with a lever. The chronicler wrote that aloud in ink and fitted numerals because suspicion now guided his next steps and because he could not yet say what he felt without recording it. That suspicion moved the prisoner to answer a question differently than he might have at dawn. They hauled him up the stone slope. The prisoner coughed, spat a ribbon of clay from his mouth, and blinked toward the warden. It was easier than it should be. The warden looked once, then tapped his ledger with a fingertip and said, "Insubordination." File it as such. The chronicler watched the ledger line and copied the wording into his own book. Within 5 sentences the central conflict stood. A suspected pattern of manufactured escape opportunities allowed the warden to justify a harsher regime. The prisoner wanted only to live and to test a seam of stone he had seen loosened in the yard. The warden wanted proof that punishment would be obeyed. The chronicler wanted an accurate record, and his recorded suspicion would determine where his loyalties landed. The prisoner had a name in the ledger. Entry number 521. Outside of the ledger, other men called him Thomas. He was 27, thin and scarred, his detention tunic stained along the seams. Guards dragged him by the shoulders while he kept his eyes on the loose stone that had swallowed the tunnel's mouth. When how he had started the hole, Thomas answered in clipped breaths, "Thomas, the warden, why did you dig?" "Thomas, I wanted out, the warden, you gave us cause." That exchange lasted 10 seconds. The chronicler did not speak. He circled the phrase "cause" several times in the margins. After the haul, the warden took the tunnel inspection into his office. The room sat above the yard with a narrow window that watched the cells like a ledger watches sums. He removed a lantern, set it on the desk, and thumbed the cover of his small ledger book. The chronicler followed, carrying a stack of paper for annotations and the single frayed scrap Thomas had been caught with. The warden did not raise his voice. He set the lantern so the flicker cut the ledger's edge, and he said, "Record it as insubordination and list the punishment." The chronicler set his paper on the desk and read the warden's note aloud as he copied it. Insubordination. 30 lashes and solitary for 7 days. The prisoner stood by the doorway, rubbing his wrist where a makeshift rope bracelet sat. He kept his gaze low. He moved like someone measuring airspace for a future step. Suspicion had moved into a new phase. Doubt about the official account. Later, in the punishment's chamber, the warden ordered the guards to display Thomas in the center of the hall. The warden spoke to the assembled prisoners in a measured voice. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Those who try to break walls will find only more walls." The warden's lips remained thin and pursed. Guards bound Thomas to a post. They scraped a mark across his shoulder with a cold iron rod, and a line of red lifted along the skin. The guards called the wound a mark of insubordination and marched Thomas before the other inmates. The warden stood at the dais and tapped the ledger. Thomas looked from face to face in the crowd and saw the same dull hope leave as men read the punishment as demonstration. In the archive interrogation nook, the chronicler took Thomas's testimony. The chronicler short, precise questions and wrote the answers. The chronicler's voice stayed even. His pauses were exact. "Thomas, where did you find the soft stone?" The chronicler. Thomas answered, "Near the cistern wall, under the moss." The stone split with a fingernail. The chronicler wrote moss, cistern, fingernail. He noted the soil composition. Did anyone help you?" "Thomas, no." The chronicler's pen stopped. He flipped to older entries. He read aloud a prior escape report that mentioned a cracked threshold at the south wall and an ease of digging. His voice remained clipped. The chronicler, entries 3, 8, and 14 report similar ease. "That is irregular." The warden was in the doorway then. Irregular chronicler, is the price of running a facility. Record the outcome and move on." The chronicler did not move on. He had been trained to catalogue precisely. He had been taught to compare. The chronicler compared ledger lines and the backhand notes of guards. He noticed a marginal caret in entry 14 and a thin notation in a different hand, opened for observation. He underlined it. In the yard late that afternoon, a baited breakout unfolded. A group of prisoners pressed toward a portion of the stone wall the warden had shown earlier, where mortar had been loosened and a shadow fell along the base. Thomas joined a band of 4 who had scavenged scrap tools from the kitchen refuse. They worked in near, silent motions, scraping, prying, whispering coordinates. The warden watched from the concealed gallery while guards stood ready in shadow. He had set the weak seam purposely and scheduled patrols to seem lax. He wanted witnesses. When the wall gave way, a single prisoner, Marcel, climbed into the breach and reached for the light beyond. Guards leaped. They seized Marcel and set him on public display. The warden named him ringleader, and the crowd watched as the warden ordered punishment on the dais. Marcel gasped, "Warden, we never—" "The warden, you tried to run." A guard shoved Marcel to the floor. The chronicler moved forward and began to write again, his hand steady but his eyes hard. The chronicler whispered the ledger's phrasing into the record, but behind his hand he penciled a note. "Seam manufactured." That night, in a damp cell corridor, Thomas pulled the frayed scrap of paper from inside his tunic. He smoothed it on his knee by candlelight. The scrap contained a short line of numbers and a name not in any ledger, a Voss, Supply Route 12. Thomas showed it to the chronicler when the chronicler came to record the day's events. The chronicler read the scrap. "Show me the ledger lines beside these dates." Thomas laid out 3 dates. The chronicler matched them to entries that had been closed with a single word. Observation. The chronicler's pen scratched. His rhythm shifted from mere copying to cross-referencing. Doubt became a procedure. Check, cross, confirm. The warden learned of the scrap because the guards reported Thomas's private talk. He invited the chronicler into his office under low lamplight and closed the door. The warden tapped a ledger page and said, "You found something. You will be careful how you write it." The chronicler put the scrap onto the desk. The notes contradict several entries. "That suggests a pattern." The warden leaned forward. His voice stayed calm. "Pattern is a dangerous word. You must preserve your reputation, chronicler. I can make your records clean, or I can make you a question." They argued in quick lines. The chronicler: "You cannot order me to omit facts." The warden: "You can be practical." The chronicler: "Practicality that hides cruelty is not my duty." The warden: "Then choose." Chronicler: "Your ledger or your standing." The exchange moved fast. Each line hit like a door. The chronicler felt fear in his jaw and anger press behind his eyes. He paused and said, "I will verify the supply lists. I will record what I find." The warden did not smile. He closed his ledger, then slid a small envelope across the desk. "Then verify," he said, "and remember where your loyalties lie." That night Thomas lay awake and replayed the day's humiliation. He rubbed the mark on his shoulder and rehearsed phrases he might say to a guard. He imagined the seam under the cistern wall and the feel of the stone under his thumb. Sometimes his fingers itched to pry a new crack. Other times they trembled. Thomas's emotions shifted from hope to fear to a brittle caution. Each shift led him to a new action or inaction. The chronicler spent hours in the archive, cross-referencing supply rotes and guard rotations. He compared the warden's ledger with the supply manifests. He found a narrow set of dates where mortar deliveries were delayed and entries in the warden's hand-noted observation windows. The chronicler wrote the observation window entries in a separate notebook and underlined them twice. In the main hall at dawn, the warden staged a public trial. He placed Thomas and Marcel on the dais and announced that he would expose the ring of escape artists who had endangered the facility. Guards read from the ledger as if they read legal charges. The chronicler stood with his book and watched the warden orchestrate the narrative. "Marcel, the warden, you conspired. You led men to break stone. Why?" Marcel spat blood. "Warden, we saw an opening. We wanted air." The warden: "You sought to undermine order. For that you will be made an example." A guard struck Marcel across the ribs. Thomas stepped forward, head down, and said, "It was not a conspiracy. We acted on a weakness." The warden snapped his head. Thomas: "Yes, warden." The warden indicated the ledger. Chronicler, record the verdict." "Guilty." The chronicler's hand hovered. He could write "guilty" and let the ledger stand as evidence that the warden's system worked. He could note margin discrepancies and risk his standing. His hesitation lasted the length of a lantern flick. Then a guard shouted from the back, "The warden says guilty." The crowd muttered agreement. The warden closed the ritual. He ordered a punishment more brutal than the first. Public lashings, forced labor in the cold dawn wind, and an additional isolation period marked in the ledger as corrective observation. The chronicler bent his head and wrote the official line. He also made a small, private entry in his separate notebook. Observation windows paired with scheduled lax patrols. He slid the paper into his coat. The final spectacle was precise. Guards dragged Marcel and Thomas before the crowd. The warden narrated each strike and labeled each consequence. He emphasized that any attempt at escape would only harden the prison's response. The chronicler recorded each word. After the punishment, in the quiet that followed, the chronicler escorted Thomas back to his cell. He walked with a measured pace and kept the secret note pressed against his thigh. Thomas looked at him. "Chronicler," Thomas' voice hoarse, "will you tell the truth?" The chronicler stopped in the corridor and set the scrap on his palm. "I will record what I can prove." Thomas breathed, and his shoulders sagged. He touched the frayed band on his wrist and said, "They used hope against us. They made us try so they could punish." The chronicler folded the scrap and slid it into his boot instead of his ledger. He allowed, then find a way to keep it safe. 2 nights later, the chronicler filed the official account in the archive. He typed the ledger entries with the warden's phrasing. He redacted where he felt pressure. He left a single marginalia in his private notebook, a string of numbers and a name linked to supply Route 12. Thomas remained marked, his shoulder scar etched in damp weather. He worked in the yard and avoided confrontation. He kept his head low and his hands busy. He listened to other men speak of the warden and measured his responses. Twice he almost spoke to a guard about the scene but thought better of it. His fear shifted back to a cautious silence. The chronicler kept watch in a different way. He catalogued entries, cross-checked deliveries, and at night he copied the marginal numbers onto a scrap he hid in the spine of an old archive book. He made that choice because he had moved from suspicion to verification to a quiet resolve. He would keep the record of wrongdoing safe until he could prove it. Days later, a young guard named Billis appeared in the archive with a complaint about a supply manifest mismatch. He the chronicler to read aloud the ledger lines for supply Route 12. The chronicler read them. Billis listened and then said, "This is odd. Why would mortar deliveries be delayed when the schedule lists full supplies?" The chronicler met Billis's eyes and said, "Find the delivery receipts." Across them, Billis left and returned with folded sheets. Here!" The receipts were signed, but the driver left a note saying stores were moved to Central. The chronicler compared the note with the warden's hand. He found a match in stroke and pressure. He tucked the folded sheets into his coat and said, "Keep this quiet." Billis nodded. "If you prove this, chronicler, what then?" The chronicler looked at the ledger. He looked at Thomas's marked shoulder. Then we decide who keeps the record and who keeps the man." The warden learned of the folded sheets because a supply clerk misfiled a receipt and a guard found it. The warden summoned the chronicler and slid his palm across the table. "You were careless with documents, chronicler." "Be thorough." The chronicler did not answer. He had already sewn the scrap into the binding of his private notebook. He had tried to turn suspicion into proof and proof into action. He had shifted from an observer to a keeper of evidence. At dawn on the day the warden planned his largest demonstration, the chronicler was arrested by 2 guards on the warden's orders and brought before the dais. The warden accused him of falsifying records. The chronicler raised his hands and said, "I recorded what I saw." "The warden, you betrayed the office." The chronicler's voice stayed even. "I only recorded irregularities." They read the charges and the chronicler felt a new emotion cut into him. The cold calculation of survival. He could not reveal his notebook. He swallowed. He kept a straight face and watched the warden close ranks. In the aftermath, the ledger remained the official truth. The warden's narrative held. Marcel's punishment broke him. Thomas lived with the mark and worked each day with his head lowered. The chronicler's private entries survived in a hidden spine and in Billis's folded receipts. These artifacts did not change the official ledger, but they preserved a contradicting truth. The final scene of the chapter came quietly. The chronicler filed his official account, closed the archive, and slipped the small scrap he had promised to keep into the heel of his boot. He felt the weight of it against his calf as he ascended the stair that led past the warden's office. Footsteps approached from above. He heard the warden's voice call once, "Chronicler." The chronicler stopped on the landing, put his hand to the scrap in his boot, and swallowed the answer. He stood very still as the warden's shadow crossed the doorway. The warden's heels clicked on the stone. That sound closed the chapter's movement. The ledger would claim the day, but the secret would ride under a boot into the next one. A stretcher bumped the infirmary sash. As the prisoner reached for the narrow opening, 2 guards locked his wrist and dragged him back across the tile. The cellmate shouted a warning, and the chronicler's pen paused on the margin. Suspicion sat in the prison like a taste in the mouth. The prisoner had learned to name it and to test it. He stepped toward the light because he believed a hand might guide him out, and he stepped because refusing that half chance would mean surrendering any control he still held. The confrontation at the infirmary window established the chapter's stake. Chance inside these walls had become an instrument, and the cost of taking that chance was visible and immediate. By the time the stretcher reached the ward, the prisoner had a name in the chronicler's notes, and a bruise beginning to bloom under his tunic. The chronicler recorded the time, the exact width of the sash, and the angle at which the light fell. He had written a similar catalogue entry after the tunnel incident. Measurements, the position of the tunnel mouth, the phrase suspicion scrawled beside a ruler mark. The prison had patterns. The chronicler's hand insisted on numbers and precise words. That insistence pushed the story forward. It turned a rumor into evidence and shaped what people would risk when someone promised them an opening. The prisoner was 27, thin and scarred, moving with the economy of someone who kept his reserves for later. He had a frayed cloth tied around his wrist and a scrap of paper folded inside his tunic. He kept his eyes low in the presence of guards and avoided the warden's gallery. Yet when the cellmate, Louis, tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the infirmary window, the prisoner felt a shift that passed through his ribs like heat. Hope arrived as a quick, physical thing, a tightened chest, a pulse that answered to a possibility. He moved because action was cheaper than waiting for punishment to arrive without provocation. "Do you see it?" Louis hissed as the stretcher neared the sash. "Stay back," the prisoner said, voice low. The guard who wheeled the stretcher gave a small angle of his head, the kind of careless signal men learned to make when they wanted prisoners to think they were sympathetic. The prisoner took one step, then another. He caught the edge of light with his fingertips. The guard's boot slammed into the stretcher, and the prisoner pitched, arms seized from behind. A public lesson began. The chronicler, who had sat in the corner with his ledger open, marked the page and wrote the time. That evening the warden sat under dim lamps and turned pages of medical logs. He called a lieutenant forward and tapped a line. "Allow him a window," the warden said. He did not raise his voice. The warden's hands were steady. The lieutenant repeated the phrase in the way subordinates repeat orders. Small, necessary, and relieved to pass responsibility upward. The warden's calculus was precise. Give the illusion of mercy, watch which men choose it, then punish the choosers more harshly to teach the rest. "Why him?" the lieutenant asked. The warden tapped the ledger with a fingertip. "We test where they break. We keep the rest in their places." The prisoner did not know the warden's ledger entries yet. He only knew that when he reached and was dragged back, the cell had felt smaller afterward. The air thickened around the other men. Fear spread in small, observable actions, hands tightening on bars, conversations that stopped when a guard passed. Those reactions fed the warden's system. The prisoner had moved because he wanted to be one fewer item in a list of failures written on paper. After the interception, his motive shifted. Suspicion had led him to try, hope had guided his hand. Now fear settled as a second, clearer route. The chronicler's role was not to intervene. He catalogued. He copied marginalia, compared ink tones, and watched for handwriting. On a desk in the archive alcove, he spread ledgers open and traced the warden's looped scrawl around specific names. Patterns emerged. Sanctioned variances, entries that allowed certain inmates assistance in designated places, plus subsequent notes about increased confinement and fines. The chronicler read a line aloud to a clerk who had been present for years. "Do you recognize this?" The chronicler. The clerk leaned in, mouth dry. "That's his hand." "Which names?" The clerk read slowly. "Ramos, Gallen, Ortiz." Those names matched prisoners who had been paraded earlier in the year. The chronicler felt an emotional shift inside his notebook. What had been clinical suspicion tilted toward clarity. He no longer only suspected organized cruelty. He held a document that redirected guilt from rumor to plan. A baited attempt came 2 nights later. A rumor had moved ahead of action. A guard had dropped a ragged bundle of cloth beside a service passage behind the kitchens. The cellmate, Lewis, said the bundle was a signal that a route existed. The prisoner chose to trust the signal because refusing would mean never trying. He slipped through the low door and crawled a short distance with cold stone rasping his palms. He smelled oil and mutton and the tang of iron in the air. A narrow barred opening promised the sky beyond. The prisoner pushed his shoulder against the barred opening. He worked his hands over the rusted iron and felt the scrape of old paint. He looked back once and saw Luce's silhouette at the service door. He pushed, and the bars did not give. Behind him a light struck hard. Guards poured through the passage, wrestling him down. The guards called him treacherous and loud enough for other cells to hear. They dragged him into the yard where the warden stood on a raised dais. The spectacle hardened the prison's lesson. The warden ordered the prisoner stripped to his tunic and walked between the prisoners as if reading a list. He pronounced a sentence meant to be seen. The crowd of inmates watched the prisoner at the base of the dais while a guard tightened a collar. The prisoner felt the humiliation physically, cold air on his bare neck, the scrape of coarse rope against his wrists. The warden aimed the punishment so others could learn by visual proof. That was the point. The prisoner understood it plainly. "You chose escape," the warden said, voice low and controlled. "I didn't choose treachery," the prisoner managed. "Choice is irrelevant if the lesson holds," the warden replied. After the public punishment, the prisoner was moved to harsher confinement. He walked between ranks of inmates who watched him like a demonstration. The chronicler recorded the time, the phrase "lesson enforced," and a ledger mark beside the prisoner's name. Back in the scribe corner, the chronicler had 2 moments of action. He copied a marginal instruction that authorized staged openings, and then he showed the copied marginalia to the clerk. "You signed this." The chronicler. The clerk's fingers trembled as he pushed the paper toward the chronicler. "I did what they told me." That confession changed the dynamic in a way that a single punishment had not. It supplied proof that the openings were not accidents. The chronicler's emotional course shifted again. Suspicion became clarity. Clarity became a cold resolve to preserve the record. For the prisoner, the shift was different. He moved from hope to fear to a brittle, focused anger. He no longer simply wanted out, he wanted the ledger exposed. In the following days, the prisoner watched the warden from his cell and measured routines. He spoke to Luz and to the chronicler when they could pass words in corners. Conversations were short. The prisoner asked specific questions. Who else saw the ledger? He whispered to Lewis, only the clerk in the scribe corner. "Lewis, can he be made to talk?" Lewis did not reply at once. He rubbed his wrist where his makeshift rope bracelet rested. Concerned silence was an action of its own. The chronicler attended the warden's gallery during a staged infirmary access, taking notes without comment. He moved like a man cataloging temperature. His face did not shift. When the prisoner was led forward in a later staged event, the chronicler documented the exact phrase the warden used. He also listened for who laughed and who flinched. The ledger entries he kept would become a map. The chronicler's hands were steady. His pen was small and precise. A mid-chapter moment nearly snapped the thin lines binding the prisoner to hope. A guard, new to the post, muttered that some openings had been arranged by accident. The prisoner heard it when the guard passed. He grabbed at that possibility instinctively and pushed the guard with a question. Did the warden order it? The prisoner demanded. The guard stopped, eyes sliding to a lieutenant. "I heard orders," the guard said, and then clammed up. 3 rapid exchanges followed between the prisoner, the guard, and a lieutenant who had been nearby. "Did you give the order?" The prisoner said, "I heard them give the order." The guard replied, "Then say it plainly." The prisoner demanded. "I can't," the guard said, voice low. The lieutenant cut in. "Enough. Move on." That scene functioned as the chapter's mini cliffhanger. The possibility that the warden's design might have an accidental element both alarmed and tempted the prisoner. He considered leveraging the guard's uncertainty. Instead, he waited and watched, making choices from a place of caution rather than impulsive hope. The chronicler continued to find corroboration in unexpected places. In the scribe corner, a clerk confessed that a tiny ledger note had been ordered to be filed under routine allowances, and that the warden initialed each of those. The clerk spoke with the thin voice of someone who had watched many punishments and wanted the record removed from his conscience. "I thought it rationalized the work," the clerk said. "It kept men orderly. You filed the note." The chronicler: "I did." The clerk's hands were ink-stained. That admission changed the prisoner's understanding of causality. Earlier he had assumed mischance shaped the openings. Now he knew the openings were engineered. The twist reoriented his strategy. He could not rely on accidental leniency. He had to assume further manipulations. When the chapter moved toward the climax, the warden staged a formal demonstration. He selected the prisoner as the instrument for a spectacle. In the outer wall observation gallery, the prisoner was marched barefoot at twilight, hands bound, the chronicler positioned to one side with his ledger open. The warden watched from above, his silhouette a dark wedge against the paling sky. Guards stood at regular intervals like punctuation marks. The prisoner was forced toward a visible opening. A false corridor of barrels and old sacks pushed him in a single direction. The crowd was arranged to see the approach and then the failure. The chronicler recorded the warden's wording as if cataloguing a ritual. The prisoner felt the tightness in his chest tighten again. This time the movement of his body expressed an internal change. He no longer sought mercy. He measured the telling of the event and determined what could be seen from the gallery and what could not. The warden's hand signaled the guards. The prisoner pushed forward into the staged opening. Men in the crowd shifted their weight. The prisoner saw the lieutenant's face and the subtle tilt of the warden's head. At the final step, the guards sprang. They seized the prisoner and hoisted him for public censure. The reprisal was thorough. Added chains, a declaration of increased confinement, and the placement of the prisoner in a cell where the roof was low and the light smaller. After the spectacle, the chronicler completed his entry. He folded a small copy of the marginal instruction and hid it within the spine of his ledger. The prisoner moved to the harsher cell, dug his knuckles into the stone, and tested the ropes that bound him. He felt anger not as an abstract seal, but as a plan forming in his hands, a list of names, a ledger, the clerk's confession. His resolve did not bloom into speeches. It took the form of choices. To wait, to watch, to keep one scrap of paper that might change who had power in the next demonstration. In the last passages of the chapter, the chronicler walked through the archive alcove in the night and locked the ledgers in place, but not before he slid a copied marginal note into a separate folio. He did not declare what he would do with that folio. He only closed the desk with the sound of a latch. The prisoner, alone in his new cell, traced the grain of the floorboard with a fingertip and listened until the guard's boots faded down the corridor. He counted the number of second ticks between each patrol and memorized them. A knock sounded at the scribe corner door at that moment, 3 sharp hits followed by a pause. The chronicler's hand tightened on the latch, and the prisoner pulled his legs up against the wall and held his breath for the pattern of footsteps. The knock was not a conclusion, it was a new hing. The ledger kept its entries. The lesson continued to be taught in flesh and iron. The prisoner decided to do something that would force an answer the next time an opening was offered, and the chronicler, with ink still on his fingers, considered whether the record alone might be enough to change the next demonstration. A guard shoved the prisoner toward the ladder and the lower rung snapped under weight and mud. He hit the stone, rolled, and hands grabbed his arms before he could scramble to the parapet. The warden watched from the gallery above and did not move. Suspicion tightened in the prisoner's chest. He had learned to read the pattern of opportunity and punishment. The ladder's broken wood smelled of wet earth. The prisoner spat soil from his mouth and tried to rise. He blinked against torchlight and met the warden's steady gaze. That look set the problem for the day. Escapes in this place were manufactured to be attempted and then punished. Heaven was not part of the moment. Physical stakes were splintered ladder, rope coils at men's hips, the warden's ledger tucked under his arm. The prisoner, panting, made a calculation. Suspicion drove him to test what he could touch and what he could not. They hauled him back over the outer wall and into sight of the gallery. The cellmate screamed a name. The chronicler, standing near the infirmary gate, watched and wrote measurements of the ladder's remaining rung. He wrote numbers down with a slow, methodical pen stroke. The chronicler's hand did not tremble, his eyes did. The prisoner hunched on the yard's flagstones and said, "This was set. Do not say it like that." The cellmate hissed. The wood split where it was cut. The prisoner. They trimmed it to tempt us. His voice had the rasp of someone who had swallowed smoke and salt. He rubbed a wrist where a cuff had left an imprint earlier in the week. The chronicler crossed the yard. He held a small ledger and a stub of pencil. Note the angle and the splice, he said. 9 degrees of lean. Rung diameter 3 centimeters. Entry aligned with the guard post. His voice was steady. He measured and paused. This is deliberate. The yard smelled of iron and damp wool. Men in coats shifted their weight. A guard said, "Orders are orders. Keep moving." He did not look up to the gallery. The prisoner listened to the warden's footfalls above. He did not speak for a long time. Suspicion moved toward a plan. He had tried a tunnel before. Chapter 1 had ended with a man dragged from a fresh tunnel mouth and wristed in iron cuffs while the warden watched. The memory of that event sat like a bruise. They marched the prisoner to the record room. The chronicler stayed with him and set the ledger open across a workbench. The chronicler ran a ruler along the page and read aloud dimensions as if cataloguing a specimen. Pit depth, 1 meter. Camouflage, green moss applied at dawn. Ladder purchased from stable vendor on the 1st of the month. The prisoner glanced at the numbers and felt the shape of a system around him. He began to name the pattern aloud. They plant openings. They time them. They watch who bites. Then they increase punishment. His voice hardened. They make hope into evidence. That sentence landed like a stone on the bench. The chronicler removed his pencil from behind his ear and said, "It reads like policy." He paused, then added quietly, "They document outcomes." Dawn scraped through the windows in narrow bars. The record room reeked faintly of oil and old paper. The chronicler's ledger had a neat marginalia. The prisoner leaned forward and touched the ink as if he could feel a meaning there. After the ladder collapse, the warden called a briefing in his office. He sat at a ledger table and outlined criteria for what he called escalation. He spoke in lists. He named thresholds. Repeated attempts within a month, assisting another prisoner, visible coordination. His lieutenants to increase staged opportunities, and to mark which men took the bait. We must preserve order. The warden, visible consequence preserves compliance. His tone did not rise. He placed a polished brass keyring on the ledger and tapped it. Record every attempt. We will document who risks and who resists. He smiled without any lift at the corners of his mouth. The guard lieutenant repeated the list and asked a logistical question about ledger entries. The warden answered precisely and added, "Make sure records are redundant. Cross-reference infirmary logs with yard reports. If a man attempts escape twice, escalators per page 12." He closed the ledger with a soft slap and stood. A guard left the office with the warden's instructions and carried them like a map. The prisoner, back in the cell, thought about the warden's phrase, visible consequence, and how it had been used to justify the last week's lashings. That phrase hardened into a motive the prisoner could aim at. In the afternoon, the prisoner and his cellmate spread a scrap of paper on a slab of stone and plotted a route they believed might lead out through a narrow service passage. They traced mortar seams and counted the guard rotations they'd learned. If we time the iron turn on the second watch, we can slip past the latrine and into the east drain, the cellmate said. They used the small scrap of paper the prisoner had kept wrapped around his wrist. Its edges were creased. The paper's ink smudged faintly under touch. The cellmate turned it over and found a watermark pattern at the margin. Faint lines, official ledger fibers. "This looks like the warden's paper," the cellmate said. He held the scrap up to a strip of light and compared it to ledger pages in the chronicler's open book. The margins matched. The ink type matched the ledger's official script. The prisoner swallowed and felt a cold clamp of doubt. Someone planted this. He looked at the cellmate, and then at the wall where they'd scraped mortar for weeks. They made a map to bait us. A new event arrived. The infirmary stretcher returned to the gate with an injured laborer, and the guards made a show of misplacing a gate latch. The prisoner watched with tightened jaw. The cellmate's hand trembled as he folded the scrap and shoved it inside his shirt collar. Later that day, the chronicler went to the archive alcove behind the infirmary. He had been keeping watch on ledger entries for discrepancies. He pulled a narrow shelf and ran his finger along spines. Behind a false binding, he found a thin stack of pages bound with hemp. He set them on the table and flipped them open. The pages were organized like a schedule. Dates, times designated, opportunities, and names with checkboxes next to a column labeled outcome. The chronicler read silently. One entry listed a planned ladder failure 2 days prior, time stamped at 3:20 in the morning. Another entry documented the planting of a scrap of paper in cell block C 3 weeks earlier. The ledger recorded punitive outcomes, corporal discipline, solitary weeks, and public examples. A duty guard walked in. He cleared his throat. "Find something interesting," he said. "This is the warden's schedule of staged openings." The chronicler. The guard's face hardened. "You shouldn't be here. The ledger lists every bait." The chronicler kept his voice flat and factual. "It lists who will take it and what punishment follows." The guard tried to minimize the entries. Pages get misplaced. Names meant other things. Paper lies. The chronicler did not look up. He slid a page into his coat. His hands moved slow and precise. He recorded the time on his notepad and pocketed a torn strip. The guard watched his fingers. The guard's shoulders slumped as if the weight of complicity had moved down his spine. He did not say another word. The prisoner, back in his damp cell, learned of the scrap's watermark from the cellmate's nervous whispers. He tapped his palm on the corner of the slab. He checked the mortar seam they had planned to widen. He felt a pressure shift from despair to guarded calculation. That was the first emotion shift. Suspicion to wary calculation. The next morning a new hook arrived. The warden ordered a staged opening at a narrow barred window on the upper cell block. He invited the chronicler to observe and to catalogue the event. The chronicler accepted because he accepted all records, and because refusal at the warden's invitation would be noticed. The prisoner was led to the upper block. The cellmate gripped his wrist. "Be careful," he said. "Do not go unless you reassure." The prisoner shook his head and climbed the ledge toward the barred window. His palms rubbed the stone until the skin stung. He looked over the sill and saw the faint line of moonlight on a distant roof. The warden stood in profile, backlit by a low lamp, ledger open on a small table. He tapped the page and raised his chin toward the chronicler. Guards waited at the ready with ropes coiled. "Begin," the warden softly. That single word started the device. The prisoner pulled his body through the iron bars, and for a breath the world compressed to the scrape of stone, and a single, bright shard of hope. Then a rope looped around his ankle and a net dropped from above. Hidden men surged. They wrenched him back through the bars, slamming his shoulder against the stone. Blood painted the edge of the sill. The prisoner gagged and a guard said, "Stop resisting." The warden tapped his ledger, not rising from his seat. The chronicler stood frozen, his pen halted above a blank line. The second emotion shift, wary calculation, folded into raw, immediate fear. The cellmate screamed and shoved a guard. "You lie!" he shouted. "You set him up!" Guards pinned the cellmate and dragged him away. The prisoner felt the grunt of leather and the burn of cuffs. A guard's fist pressed into his ribs. The chronicler, with slow, deliberate motion, slid torn ledger pages into his coat. His hands were shaking, but he acted with a distinct purpose. He did not intervene physically. He took the record. The warden catalogued the outcome. He read the box marked escalation and crossed a name out with a steady line. "This demonstrates consequence," he said. "The others will see and adjust their behavior." The chronicler folded his notebook and walked to the infirmary doorway. He did not say a word. He put the torn pages into the inner pocket of his coat. His heartbeat thudded under his ribs and his palms left damp smudges on paper. He had moved from detached observer to covert participant. Outside, the yard bent toward routine. The warden returned to the ledger table and made new entries. He did so with an almost proud slowness. The chronicler watched the numbers and felt the ledger weigh in his coat. He remembered the ladder's 9-degree lean and the scrap's watermark. He remembered the guard's attempt to dismiss the evidence. The prisoner lay in the infirmary cot with his shoulder strapped and a bruise swelling near his eye. He breathed shallowly. He pressed his fingertips into the split lower lip that had opened again when he hit the sill. He nothing at first. Then he said, "They plant our hope and charge us for it." They turned wanting into a crime. The cellmate sat on a stool and dictated what he had seen to the prisoner, short lines, breathy and sharp. "They gave us a ladder." The rung was cut. The scrap, he slapped the table. The scrap matched the ledger paper. The prisoner closed his eyes and pictured the warden's ledger with its checked boxes. He pictured the chronicler's hand slipping a page into his coat. He sat up and said, "We need proof beyond us. The ledger in the archive. If it leaves the walls, they cannot call it fiction." The chronicler's theft had created a new crack in the warden's architecture. That was a twist the warden had not planned for. The guard who tried to minimize the ledger entries had shown an unguarded expression when the chronicler took a page. The chronicler had noticed it. He had also noticed the ledger's coded margins and columnar keys. A second external event arrived. The duty guard who had been evasive confronted the chronicler in the yard later that night. "You shouldn't have taken that," the guard said. "I recorded it as found." The chronicler answered, "If the warden sees you with it." The guard began, then stopped. He had an expression like a man who had been given a role he did not want. "You saw the entries." The chronicler, "You watched how they staged the ladder. You were there when they planted the scrap." He looked at the guard's hands. "Why did you not speak?" The guard's jaw tightened. "Because I was ordered. Because I have a family. Because I keep my head down and collect my wages." The chronicler nodded. He did not ask for heroism. He for a small action. Delay a log, misplace a report, let a page pass in a dispatch. The guard swallowed and agreed to a minimal complicity. A note misfiled, a ledger cover left ajar. The prisoner felt a cautious hope at this. Not the ladder's false light, but a quiet maneuver that might let a page travel outside the walls. He and the cellmate spoke in short, clipped sentences about where the chronicler could hide the pages, under linen at the infirmary supply, the prisoner suggested. In a boot heel when peddlers come through, they moved like conspirators. They practiced a sequence of handoffs, chronicler to guard to medic to peddler. Each action was small and specific. Each action carried risk, and that risk now felt like a tool rather than a punishment. The warden, meanwhile, increased staged openings. He ordered more bait. He framed the policy as necessary: control, deterrence, and public example. He began to press harsher outcomes for men who failed to resist the lure. He spoke to a captain and said, "We must convert hope into confession." It is efficient. The chronicler, carrying torn pages, found a temporary hiding place in the infirmary's linted bandage chest. He wrapped the papers in a strip of old cloth and sewed them into a seam where a supply cart would later sit. He wrote small marginal notes on a scrap that he left in plain sight to test who would notice. A phrase about a rung clipped 2 days prior. A mid-chapter cliffhanger came when the guard lieutenant announced a surprise muster in the yard at dawn. The prisoner and cellmate had planned an exchange at first light. They had scheduled the peddler's arrival precisely at 7. The muster threatened everything. They had to move sooner or find a different handoff. The prisoner felt adrenaline rather than fear. He acted. They altered the plan. The cellmate would distract a medic in the infirmary, while the chronicler slipped the sewn parcel into the peddler's blanket in the supply cart. The exchange happened in staged haste. The cellmate clattered a tray and drew a medic's attention. The chronicler, fingers steady, nudged the cart and positioned the parcel with a practiced motion. Outside the walls, a peddler received the blanket and carried it away with a muttered bargain. The warden's system relied on routes and receipts. The peddler, who promised to travel to a neighboring market town, would carry the record beyond the prison's direct sight. The prisoner watched the cart roll through the gate and felt the ledger press against his skin like a new weight of trust. The day of public reprisal arrived. The warden staged another attempt in the presence of a cluster of prisoners he wanted to terrify. He made sure the chronicler would be present to observe and that the guards would execute precisely. The prisoner knew the pattern. He also knew the ledger was now outside the walls. As the prisoner climbed toward the narrow window, the warden signaled. The same trap closed with a finality that bruised bone. The chronicler, who had been cataloguing dimensions, watched the moment and did not raise his pen. Instead, he pressed a small note into his palm and let it be covered by cuffed fingers. They dragged the prisoner back across the yard in front of everyone. The warden read the list of consequences aloud. Men counted the names as if at a roll call. The warden's voice remained calm and merciless. "This is justice," he said. The chronicler edged to the infirmary doorway and, while the warden spoke, slipped another torn ledger page out of his inner coat and wrapped it into a bandage's hollow. He did not meet anyone's eyes. He breathed in the smell of antiseptic and iron and felt a small surge of determination. The ledger now had two rotes outward, the peddler's blanket and the bandaged chest. That night the yard settled into its routine. The prisoner lay in a cot with his shoulder bound. The warden retreated to his ledger table and catalogued the day's outcomes with a bureaucratic hand. He wrote names and check marks as if compiling inventory. The chronicler moved quietly to the archive and slipped a page under a false bottom of a dispatch crate. He left a margin note. To be traced, he had not yet decided whom to trust beyond the guard who had agreed to misfile a report. He had, however, created a chain of small failures in the warden's procedure that might let a page escape public eyes. On the morrow, a messenger arrived in the market town with a bundled blanket and an unnoticed ledger page sewn inside. The peddler sold a trinket and walked to a tavern where a traveling clerk accepted a blanket in trade. The clerk opened the blanket to count his coins and found the paper. He read the column headings and paused. He folded it and put it in his satchel. At the same time, inside the prison, the chronicler's sewn parcel in the infirmary was later retrieved by a supply driver making a delivery run to an allied monastery. The driver, used to odd bundles, did not read the margins, but a novice at the monastery did. He opened the linen and saw the ledger's layout. He did not understand every code, but he recognized entries that planned openings and recorded punishments. The ledger began to travel beyond walls in two different streams. One through market trade, another through charitable supply lines. The warden's archive showed an empty space where pages had been. He ran his finger along the ledger's spine later and frowned at the missing tooth in the binding. The prisoner met the chronicler in a narrow corridor that night. Their sentences were short and rapid. "You took risk." The prisoner: "I did what the record required." The chronicler replied: "Will it reach someone who can read it?" The prisoner: "It will reach someone who will see names and dates." The chronicler: "Names and dates compel action outside our walls." They did not talk of heroism. They listed actions: the peddler, the clerk, the novice, the misfiled report. Each item was concrete and named. The prisoner wrapped his bandaged hand around a cup of thin soup and listened. Days later, a visitor arrived at the monastery. A clerk carried a folded ledger page in his bag and showed it to an elder who had been a scribe for a regional court. He recognized the structure. He read the list of scheduled openings and the column marked "Outcome." He frowned and then he wrote a short note requesting verification from the captain of a nearby garrison. The warden's design began to crack because the ledger's margins meant action in the outside world. An inquiry, polite and formal, arrived at the prison's gate. The captain asked for an explanation of recorded operations and requested to review logs. The warden, who had believed control inside the walls equaled total impunity, walked toward a formality he could not control. The warden met the captain and offered an explanation of policy and order. "We manage risks," he said. "We record to maintain discipline." The captain's face remained unreadable. He requested to see the ledger. The warden hesitated and then handed over the book with a stiff motion. The captain opened the ledger and found torn margins, misfiled pages, and annotations. He held two separate pages that had been found outside the walls and compared the ink and watermarks. The ledger's story stopped feeling contained. The captain's eyes narrowed. He wrote a short note and left. Inside the prison, the warden shut his door and catalogued the day's punishments in his own hand. He plotted the next set of staged openings. He did not know yet which of his practices would be questioned at a regional level. His ledger, once a private instrument of control, now produced evidence that would be read by strangers. The prisoner watched the warden from the infirmary doorway. He had been beaten, but his shoulder would heal. He had been tricked, but the trick had produced a chain. He held the memory of the cellar tunnel and the man dragged from it in Chapter 1, and the stretcher incident in Chapter 2. Those memories had taught him that physical actions set facts in motion. He put that learning to work now. One evening the captain returned with officers and a small notary. They inspected the ledger and compared dates. They questioned guards who had been careless and asked formal questions the warden had not expected to answer. The warden's tone shifted from pride to explanation. The captain demanded accounts and ordered the ledger to be sealed pending investigation. The chronicler found the prisoner in the yard after the officers had left. The prisoner had a new look, a tempered, quiet focus. He had moved from wanting escape to wanting exposure. "We have done what we can." The chronicler, "You started it." The prisoner replied, "You wrote the numbers and you slipped the pages. You gave me the moments to write about." The chronicler, "You tested the openings and they confirmed what the ledger had been recording. They did not claim victory." There was no exultation. There was simply a record altered and an external actor now asking questions. The warden sat in his office with a sealed ledger missing pages and with a list of names who had been punished for attempting escape. He catalogued those punishments on a fresh page and circled several for harsher sentences. The prisoner listened from the yard to a new round of shouts and watched men who had taken bait being marched to solitary. That was the cost. The warden still wielded power, but a seed of accountability had been planted beyond his ledger's confines. The chronicler slipped another page, this time an index of named opportunities, into a small hollow in a carved beam in the infirmary. He had decided not to keep all evidence on his person. He distributed pieces across several mundane channels: a peddler's trade, a monk's laundry, a misfiled log. The ledger's reach now extended beyond the warden's protected desk. In the final night of this chapter, the warden sat alone and catalogued the day's outcomes with bureaucratic pride. The prisoner, recovering in a cot, watched him through a narrow slit of barred light. The chronicler moved quietly to the infirmary doorway and tapped his coat where a torn page rested in a sewn seam. A delivery knock came at the gate. A peddler requested shelter for the night. A monk delivered bread to the infirmary. A captain paced with a stamped order. The warden looked up and noted each arrival in his ledger. He wrote down the names of men who had been punished and checked the box marked "Effect." He could still declare order achieved and point to bodies and broken limbs as evidence. Then the chronicler opened the infirmary supply and took out a bandage. From inside he pulled a folded strip of ledger and walked to the gate with measured steps. He handed the folded page to a clerk who had arrived in plain clothes and said only, "Trace this." The chronicler's hands did not tremble now. They were steady and practiced. The final beat of the chapter is concrete. A ledger page changing hands beyond the warden's office. A captain reading column headings. A peddler moving through a market with a sewn parcel. A monk finding a page inside linen. Each is a small event that together dismantle the warden's claim of total control. The warden catalogued the day's punishments and circled one name for increased severity. He believed in paperwork as both instrument and victory. He did not yet see how the ledger would betray him. The chronicler, the prisoner, the cellmate, and a handful of uneasy guards had taken tiny, specific actions that rerotted evidence. The ledger now had a life outside the ledger case. The chapter closes in motion. The chronicler walks out into a thin rain and hands a folded page to a clerk under the lamp outside the gate. The clerk slides it into his satchel and tucks it under a roll of cloth. The prisoner hears the gate close and feels the rhythm of lock and bolt. He turns his head and whispers, "Let them read it." The chronicler nods once. Beyond the walls, in a tavern, a clerk unfolds the page and reads the warden's scheduled openings. He frowns, makes a notation, and writes a letter to an authority who has teeth and reach. The ledger's migration has begun. Concrete events close the chapter. A page handed into a clerk's satchel. A captain sealing a ledger, a peddler walking away with a blanket, the warden circling a name, and the prisoner listening to the gate bolt. The last sentence of this chapter is an action. The chronicler folds his coat collar against the damp and steps away from the infirmary with empty hands, but with several pages now moving beyond the wall. The ledger will be read. The warden will be asked to account. The prisoner will heal and prepare. The chronicler will continue to measure and to move records. The apparatus of manufactured hope has been exposed to outside scrutiny. That exposure arrived by hands and roots, not by speeches. The chapter ends with a lock turning in the great gate and the soft sound of a page sliding into a satchel.